Hello and welcome to China Dispatches, a European Chamber podcast that shares on-the-ground insights from European business leaders and experts on doing business in China. I'm your host, Gao Rui. Today we're going to do a review of 2024. I'm joined by three of the Chamber's colleagues in Beijing to talk about their choices of 2024 keywords or events. First, I'll ask my colleagues to introduce themselves, starting from Mariann.
I'm Mariann, Policy and Communications Manager here at the Chamber's Beijing office. I usually work on reports and our media communications, and also I work on the China Shortcuts podcast with you.
Hi, I'm Ester. I look after European affairs, that is the Chamber's overall engagement with EU institutional stakeholders, and I also support the implementation of an EU-funded project, the EU SME Center.
My name's Hayward. I'm the General Manager of the Beijing chapter. I'm also Director of Communications for the European Chamber and I'm working on all our reports and media statements. I come on podcasts when you don't have anybody else.
That is not true. Before our speakers here share their choices of keywords or events, let's hear from some of the Chamber's Executive Committee and board members of their choices. First one is President Jens Eskelund.
The word of the year that I have chosen for 2024 is deflation, because I think that deflation has been the single most impactful phenomenon that we have seen, not just as European businesses, but businesses in general in China. We have seen now for 26 consecutive months that producer prices have been declining, and we have seen now how that has eroded profitability and it has been eating into the margins of our member companies. That is a main reason that we have seen the lowest confidence on record in our business confidence survey, which we launched in May this year. Now, we are hopeful that the situation will change in China, maybe not in the very short term, but we take some comfort in the fact that the government is recognizing that there is serious supply-demand imbalances in China, and also that they need to get some work done on the demand side to try to restore a healthy balance. So hopefully we over time will be able to deal with deflation and revert to a more normal level of profitability for our companies. So hopefully we'll be able to choose another word next year, but for 2024, deflation will be the word of the year.
Does anyone choose a similar keyword?
I think for me, related would be consumption. One of the major factors, obviously, this year in China's faltering economy has been just very, very low consumption. There's been a lot of emphasis on the supply side. As a chamber, we've been advocating that more needs to be done to try to increase consumption. We think this should be much more of a fundamental driver of China's economy. And of course, this is related to deflation, the deflationary pressure that companies are witnessing, and also related to what Jens is saying about profitability of our companies, that we saw in the BCS this year that we've hit something of a turning point, which is where 71% of respondents to the survey for 2024 said that their EBIT in China is now equal to or less than the global average, which on the face of it doesn't sound too bad. I mean, essentially you're saying that still 71% are doing okay. I think the issue that this raised for us is it's not just purely about profitability or levels of profitability. It's the fact that profitability in China is dropping at the same time that the risks are increasing. So the question that, some members are starting to ask is, why China? If I can get the same or even better returns on my investment in other parts of the world with less risk, why wouldn't I opt to do that instead? I think deflation is a good word to choose, and I think it links to a number of other major concerns that the Chamber's outlined this year.
We could also look at risk as being the buzzword of the year because, of course, we see that not just the EU, but also other markets are looking into different ways of mitigating risks, and so do companies. The first report we published this year was Riskful Thinking, which looked into these different strategies that EU, the US, and China are shaping up to make their own markets more resilient to different geopolitical trends, geopolitical concerns, and also to the growing trade tensions between them. We also see our own companies coming up with more and more strategies to mitigate risks. We also saw a growing pessimism. That was actually my first choice for a buzzword for this year. We saw a growing pessimism among our companies, and our president in his comment just now expressed hope for the future and hope that things are going to get turned around. But certainly if they don't get turned around, if we don't see a shift in these major trends or major policy trends in China, then I think that pessimism will continue.
The lowest rate of optimism over future profitability, right, we've ever seen in the BCS, and I think it was only 15% of companies optimistic about their future profitability.
Yes, but at the same time, we also saw the record high level of pessimism.
You mentioned consumption is a big topic to drive China's economy.
Yeah.
And we do see policies like the trade-ins of consumer goods. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think, these are good ways of trying to put a little bit more money in the pockets of the average consumer. But I think these kind of measures need to be weighed against, again, let's go to the topic that Mariann just talked about, which is risk. I mean, the average person went through a pretty traumatic time during COVID. Many of them went through their savings very, very quickly because of severe illnesses, or some of them were being, laid off work. And these kind of experiences don't fade in the memory very, very quickly. So I think one of the issues is that even if you do start to try to find ways to transfer wealth to households, I think the mindset in general is still geared towards mitigating their own personal risk. So whether that is trying to rebuild their savings pot, or with an eye on, future potential issues with, serious healthcare issues. I think it's just that the mentality hasn't shifted yet. People are just much more personally risk averse. And I think, particularly in the China context, has always had a very, very high rate of household savings. I think it's going to take something quite significant, and it will take quite a long time to kind of turn that around.
Okay. The second one is from Tianjin chapter chair, Christoph Schrempp. Does anyone want to take a guess of what he chose?
I can take a guess maybe, because I remember that in the BCS, one of the issues that the Tianjin chapter specifically highlighted was the issue of talent attraction for them. And also another issue that Tianjin is probably really focused on is carbon neutrality, is the access to green energy. So maybe something along those lines.
That's a good guess.
Yes. So he actually provided two keywords. One of them is about
Congratulations.
decarbonization. Yes. Okay. Let's hear from Christoph.
Elections. Elections are a powerful tool in the hands of those who have the right to elect. This year, 40% of world's population had the right to elect their new government, and therefore to entrust people to run the country for the good of their purpose. Sometimes I ask myself if those ones who have this right are aware that it's not only about their own country, but that the impact of the electing a government reaches much further than their own country itself and stops not at the borderline. That reminds me that next time while exercising that right very soon, I'll be extremely cautious whom I'm going to elect, to consider not only country's responsibility, but also a kind of global responsibility. Elections put also some wrinkle on my forehead, since the upcoming elections for the European Chamber, and especially the chapter in Tianjin, put us again in front of the difficult situation to find enough candidates so that our member companies really have a chance to elect to whom they want to entrust the power for the coming 2 years.
As someone looking after European affairs and watching what's going on in Europe, yes, I would say that elections were a word that I paid a lot of attention to. This year, we had the expected, which was the EU elections, and of course, elections in other countries, India, the US, Russia, and so on and so forth. But we also had some surprises, like the French legislative elections, which, let's just be honest, didn't work very well for Emmanuel Macron. This year, we had national level elections in 74 countries. That's half of the population in the world that went to the ballots. It's just staggering.
I think I'd like to pick up on one of the points that Christoph made, which is he said he personally, when he goes to the ballot booth rather, that he will try to be more mindful on the impact the choice that he makes will have on the rest of the world. And I think that's right. I think that's exactly what people should be doing more of. I just don't see it happening. I mean, I think more and more people are making their choices based on their own personal circumstances, their own personal needs and desires. Much of it is driven by promises from people that are trying to be voted in, that they will make their lives better. I don't think there's been any elections this year where there's been real discussion about policies that are about making the world a better place. I mean, yes, there's been talk about continued focus on decarbonisation, for example, but in general, politicians are much more focused on local policies and improving the life of their electorate. So I think to be able to think outside of that is very, very difficult. But I do think that's something that more people should think of. I just don't really see that happening.
Particularly in the European context, because as we know, what happens in a member state has the potential of impacting just overall EU policy and strategy. And in the EU, I mean, it's not only France and Germany. Those are the countries that people tend to pay most attention to. But we are seeing a shift in the balance of power. And that is a result of elections and new leadership in other member states.
Just to add something to this idea of how, elections can have an impact on the world. But I think another thing that maybe voters don't usually think about is how the world looks at their national elections and how there is sometimes interference because there are other things at play which they don't necessarily consider. And for instance, we just saw this in Romania where there was an alleged interference in the elections coming from TikTok. So it does have some relation to some connection to China as well, I guess. So I think that it is important to consider from both angles for voters that what does their vote mean for the world and how the world might want to influence their vote as well.
Does anyone choose a similar keyword?
I guess that my keyword would be competitiveness. Competitiveness has been the name of the game in the EU throughout 2024. The outgoing commission tasked Mario Draghi, the former head of the European Central Bank, with developing what eventually ended up being quite a comprehensive roadmap to enhance European competitiveness. And this idea that we're falling behind, our industrial base in Europe is under threat, has translated into quite a lot of emphasis being put into competitiveness, both through this report, but also in political guidelines for the Commission, the 2025-2029 Council strategic guidelines. It's a big task. It's a buzzword, is a keyword. Let's see how it gets translated into on-the-ground action.
So I'm just wondering if you think it will actually function as a call to arms for not just the EU, but for individual member states to recognize some of the things that need to be done to increase Europe's competitiveness.
We have visited Brussels several times this year, and in our latest conversations with stakeholders from the different EU institutions and member states, what we're hearing is a consensus on the need for action. There are different views in member states. Again, financing is set to be quite a contentious point because you have member states that favor less state intervention and less state support. And state support will be an important part of bridging this financing gap. Don't get me wrong. I mean, private investment will also be key. What I can say is that we do have a very strong commission. Von der Leyen to commission, I would expect that in areas where the Commission has exclusive competencies, there could be some progress being made.
Previous episode of China Dispatches was actually on EU elections and EU-China-US relations, and Ester was the speaker in that episode as well. If you would like to know more about the EU elections, you can go back to the last episode and listen to that. Okay, let's hear from the second keyword from Christoph.
Sustainability. Sustainability for me is very important, and I have the impression that in 2024 it became something which was forgotten amongst the topics of tariffs, violence, wars in the Middle East, in Ukraine, geopolitical tensions, elections in the US. One has the impression no one really looked at the topic of sustainability. And that can't be. I'd like to remind that it's all our responsibility to take care of our planet, to make sure that what we are doing is sustainable. The more I'm proud that here the chapter in Tianjin continued to have the carbon neutrality conference, which was upgraded this year as it's the fourth one to a carbon neutrality summit. And we will continue with this series of high-level exchanges to make sure that we take care of our planet and take sustainability for serious.
I mean, I wouldn't say that sustainability has not been in the agenda of policymakers or companies, but we have seen some concerning trends this year. So maybe I start with the good news. And the good news is that according to our business confidence survey, 7 out of 10 respondents were on track in the process of decarbonizing. The not so good news is that this year, more respondents have indicated that they were delaying their decarbonization plans. And to me, that is a clear sign that the government should accelerate action to address some of the gaps that are needed in order to help companies achieve these goals. Christoph mentioned access to green electricity. Access to green electricity is the vehicle for, I think, 80% of our respondents to decarbonize.
I'm really pleased to hear Christoph choose that word, and I do think that sustainability, it's the issue, it's the existential threat of global warming that is always at the back of things. I think the problem is that this is a good exemplification of what I was talking about earlier, whereby you have these large global issues that we all know are important, but on a day-to-day basis, people get distracted by day-to-day issues. Yeah, decarbonizing, having access to sustainable sources of fuel isn't in the front of people's minds when they just basically want to be able to fill up their car more cheaply, or they're distracted by other domestic issues. So I think far too often the domestic agenda takes over in politics, and it obscures these enormous issues that eventually we are all going to have to deal with. And I think in that respect, some of the signals that came out of COP29 were not very encouraging.
We are disappointed with the outcome, which clearly brings out the unwillingness of the developed country parties to fulfill their responsibilities.
And we feel it is ambitious, it is needed, it is realistic, and it is achievable. And we are confident that this will be a tale of delivery.
Often these things seem to be a scrabble with countries compromising to come up with some wording that will be acceptable, while at the same time not really coming out with anything of real substance that is going to alleviate the concerns that people have. So it's good that Christoph mentions it. This is a top advocacy priority of the Chamber, and it has been for a number of years now with our carbon neutrality initiative. Yeah, we will continue to push for this. Hopefully, China will become the leader that everybody believes it will be in sustainable energy, and our members will be able to decarbonize their operations as a result.
When companies' profits decreasing, do you see companies prioritize profitability over their decarbonization agenda?
I think that's just a simple dynamic. I mean, that's what shareholders demand their returns. So profitability is always going to be prioritized in a market where you're facing those kind of responsibilities. People talk about the fact that there are already solutions out there in a number of different industries in order to be able to green the economy, in order to have sustainable sources of fuel, whether it's in maritime, whether it's in aerospace. The problem is that these solutions are not a suitable scale where they are affordable, perceived to be affordable. And so until that takes place, unfortunately, people will always be driven by the profit motive.
Yeah, and this is where government comes in, right? I mean, there is a role for government to bridge the investment gap.
Yes.
But also there is a role for the government to develop clear and predictable policies and regulations so that companies have a roadmap and are able to make the long-term investments that they need to do.
And standards as well. I mean, you need to have global standards. I mean, if you are moving towards a sustainable fuel solution for aircraft, for example, you need to be able to refuel in whichever country you land in, and the infrastructure has to be the same. So standards is a huge driver of this too.
Both of the following recordings are related topics. Let's hear from State's Representative Gianni di Giovanni.
The key word I choose is global cooperation on fighting climate change. This year was an important node for UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, COP29. This compact not only set climate finance targets and the related arrangements after 2025, but also further consolidates the world's determination to work together to meet the challenges of climate change and promote the global climate cooperation. 2025 will be crossroad year for the climate change issue because the new Trump administration, new EU government and China play a leading role in achieving the 2030 years goal of decarbonization for energy transition. Time is short, yet many challenges remain. To solve the problem of climate change, it ultimately depends on an exhaustive and sustainable change in the development model. The international community should work together to accelerate energy transformation, maintain the stability of a new energy industry, and promote the accessibility and innovation of green products and technologies.
Gianni mentioned green financing, which is something that our members in banking have been advocating for because it's something that foreign banks have limited access to in China. So this is an important area where they could actually support foreign companies operating in China to decarbonize further.
We have seen some progress in the past 2 years with a couple of international banks being included, but again, there's certainly room for improvement.
I also want to just pick up on something that Gianni referred to quite briefly, is Trump. People always talk about the fact that the world cannot reach carbon neutrality without China. You know, the fact that China is responsible for 30% of all carbon emissions, of course, that's a logical kind of conclusion to draw. But equally, the world can't reach that without the US. And I think that one of the most worrying aspects of Trump's election is that he doesn't acknowledge the science behind climate change.
No, it's one of the great scams of all time. You know why they don't talk about it? Because people aren't buying it anymore.
And that's extremely worrying. He's very much influenced by big business. He's a very transactional person in nature. It seems unlikely that he will be the bastion of pushing forward the green transition in the US. So we're potentially facing another 4 years of delays and maybe even some reversals on the progress that we've made so far.
Well, now that the orange elephant is in the room, maybe I can provide perhaps the slightly more optimistic take, which is this should be, mark my word, an incentive for the EU and China to cooperate more closely on environment, climate, and energy. This is an area where we have observed a degree of progress in the past couple of years, especially as bilateral exchanges have resumed. Let's use this to enhance this cooperation.
Fingers crossed.
I think what is a little bit concerning is China's focus on building up the domestic industry. And what I think is missing there is the focus on what are the better products from the sustainability angle. And often European companies have an advantage there, but it seems like that's not what the Chinese policymakers are focusing on either, which of course is then problematic because they also have their targets for carbon neutrality.
We can continue the discussion after we hear from the last speaker, Vice President Massimo Bagnasco.
The key word I've chosen is carbon neutrality, because it's a driver for economic transformation. In today's challenging economic environment, carbon neutrality offers a blueprint for creating a new shared model of sustainable economic development. Both China and Europe have set ambitious goals that require drastic reshaping of their economic models across value and supply chain, as well as changes to their individual daily lives. If implemented fairly and effectively, the decarbonization agenda presents a vast opportunity for joint innovation and business development across all the industrial and service sectors. Taking real estate and construction as an example, the sector is currently undergoing significant challenges. A shift towards retrofitting and optimizing existing buildings rather than focusing solely on new construction can improve building quality and energy performance in alignment with carbon neutrality targets and promote sustainable development in economic growth in this strategic sector. All in all, achieving carbon neutrality is not only about preserving our planet, it is also a catalyst for economic transformation and long-term prosperity model that will mobilize investment and unlock business opportunities, creating new jobs.
Massimo makes a very good point about shifting the focus to making buildings more sustainable instead of investing into infrastructure or other types of construction projects which are just there to increase the GDP, because that used to be basically a role of the construction sector. And I think that shifting the focus to a more sustainable construction would be key, both for carbon neutrality, but also to actually make Chinese economic growth more sustainable.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think another thing I just want to pick up on what Massimo said, he just put it far better than I did, which is in order to get this really going, you have to incentivize people. So I think the point he made about the fact that this will actually unleash, investment, the transition itself will be, a new driver of growth is something that I think is important to make clear.
I think incentivizing is a good point, but then it is difficult to see what the incentives can be. I think subsidizing some of these retrofittings would be a good way, but then unfortunately what we see, for instance, in other countries where these kind of projects are done or these kind of subsidies are provided, is that the incentive for people to still do these investments with the subsidy is that their utility fees will go down. But in China, utility fees are already so low. I think it's a bit of a tough...
it's a tough sell, which is true. But if you then, sort of focus on the fact that what you need to be doing is making sure the electricity that people are using to heat their homes and to cook their food will eventually be generated by green sources of energy, which are more expensive, then that would hopefully bring about a gradual offsetting of those things.
Yeah, and then I guess we're circling back to the beginning of the conversation with deflation and weak consumption, low consumer confidence. It is kind of difficult to address both of these issues at the same time.
That's all for today. Thank you very much, Mariann, Ester, and Gao for joining. If you like our podcast, please subscribe to China Dispatches, recommend it to your colleagues and friends, and share it on social media. Also, we'd love to hear your feedback. You can find contact details in our show notes. This is Gao Rui from China Dispatches. Thanks for listening.